to Zero builds on the work that Climate Action Network Canada has been doing for years to bring civil society together to create pathways to a just and safe future for everyone. In the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has really driven home the need for collaboration across sectors to address the cracks that have appeared in our social and economic systems. And it's in that spirit of cross-cutting collaboration that we bring you this webinar series. These sessions are intended to generate smart, thoughtful discussion about how we create just and equitable pathways toward decarbonization. We want to leave you with an informed and energized feeling of hope that's inspired by the commitment and passion of so many brilliant and generous people from all walks of life who are joining us here. For the full schedule, you can visit our website again. It's climateactionnetwork.ca/pathways to zero. And here you'll find details on each week's webinar, including the speakers, the registration links, and recordings of each of the previous webinars. So if you miss a week or you know someone who might want to check out a particular topic, know that the videos will always be there for you. Again, I'll remind you the series is available in both English and French, so make use of our fantastic interpreter services. We have Alex with us doing interpretation today, so thanks, Alex. And now let's turn to today's webinar. So today I'm joined by 4 leaders in innovation and ingenuity to discuss the work that's bringing our collective clean future into the present day. 2 of our speakers work in the area of policy and theory, and 2 work more hands-on at the community level to implement climate adaptation and mitigation solutions. We'll start off with learning a bit about some theory. What are some of the prospective transitional pathways that are ahead of us on this journey to zero emissions? And what considerations and implications should we be alert to that might make one pathway more attractive or feasible than another? We'll then turn to learning about 2 different examples of approaches to decarbonization. First, we'll look at climate co-benefits that stem from air quality remediation in the city of Ottawa. And then we'll look at ways in which Indigenous communities, and in particular Indigenous children, are considering and adapting to climate change impacts in their lives. In the end, we're going to circle back and have a short group discussion that digs into how we holistically approach this challenge of living through the decarbonization transition. So again, throughout the discussion, please post any questions you have in the chat. Our presenters will try to attempt to answer them there. I'm going to try to be really good about keeping us on track with time so that we do have that time at the end for the discussion. And watch for me to give you 1-minute warnings, presenters. So I may interject from time to time to remind you of that. So let me introduce our 4 panelists who we have with us today. Dr. James Meadowcroft is the Research Director for Transition Accelerator. James is a professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. He's written widely on environmental politics and policy, democratic participation and deliberative democracy, national sustainable development strategies, and socio-technological transitions. James's recent work focuses on energy and the transition to a low carbon society and includes publications on CCS, or carbon capture and storage, smart grids, the development of Ontario's electricity system, the politics of socio-technological transitions, and negative carbon emissions. Jason Dion is the Mitigation Research Director for the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices. Previously, Jason was the lead researcher with Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission and a project manager and economist at IISD, or the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Jason's work has focused on carbon pricing, environmental risk and financial assurance, green public procurement, and sustainable infrastructure. Jake Cole is a board member of the Sierra Club of Canada, and he's the project lead of Breathe Easy, the organization's air quality initiative. And finally, Lewis Archer works with Save the Children's National Reconciliation Program, working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across the country on climate change, emergency, and now COVID-19 programs. Lewis currently resides in Toronto, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Welcome all, and thank you so much for contributing today. Okay, so that was a lengthy preamble. Now let's get into this conversation. Jason, I'm going to start with you. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices recently released a report called Canada's Net Zero Future, in which you've used a mix of safe bets and wildcards to describe 3 possible pathways by which Canada might reach net zero emissions by 2050. In this opening segment, I'd love for you to give us a brief overview of this work.
Yeah, happy to do so, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm a mitigation research director for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, calling from Ottawa today on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin. And yeah, happy to give a quick overview, and I will ruthlessly stick to the allotted 10 minutes, Tika, fear not. Stand by while I share my screen. There we are. So I wanted to just start with a very quick overview of exactly how this study came together and what we did in it. So this is the product of a year of work from our team here, and including a lot of engagement from experts and academics that have helped guide and shape our work. And in terms of the methods that we brought to bear in this analysis, we've used modeling, literature review, expert input, stakeholder consultation, all to drive what is at the end of the day a scenario analysis. So we've looked at actually over 60 different scenarios of Canada getting to net zero by 2050. And we've really selected and built these scenarios to reflect the uncertainty that exists around parts of how that transition could play out. So we're looking at drivers and variables that will make a big difference in how that transition looks in Canada, but that aren't always in Canada's control. So across our scenarios, we're varying assumptions around things like, what is the degree of climate policy action in other major countries? What are the cost of key GHG reducing technologies? What's the level of future global oil demand and prices? And critically as well, what are the availability and cost of negative emissions technologies? So a bit of a departure from your theme of pathways to zero, where we're focused on net zero in this particular report. So together, these pathways, these scenarios, represent the larger possibility space that exists around how a transition could look. That does not mean they're equally likely. Certainly some would come with a lot more barriers than others, and we spend a lot of time unpacking a lot of those barriers in our report. But they are all theoretically possible pathways. And what we've tried to do in this report, and what I'll do here in this presentation, is rather than zooming in and looking individually at these scenarios, we tend to zoom out and look across all of them to ask the question of, well, what's consistent? You know, what shows up again and again, regardless of how Canada's transition plays out? And where there are differences, what are the drivers of those differences? So with that bit of background out of the way, let's get into some of the key findings. So lots in the report, but there's just a kind of few key parts I wanted to highlight today. And one is what Tika noted of this finding around what we call the safe bets versus the wild card and wildcards. And what we find there is that of all the sort of solutions and technologies that we can think of, you know, our analysis shows you can really break them down into two basic categories. And that's what we call these safe bets versus wildcards. So the safe bets are things that are commercially available today and have no major constraints to scaling them up. They're also the things that show up consistently across all of our scenarios. So no matter how that transition plays out, these things are there playing a driving role. And it's a familiar list. So the list includes things like non-emitting electricity, electric vehicles, electric heat pumps in buildings, and also things like methane management in the industry sector. So you can contrast that with the wildcards. The wildcards are those things that are demonstration stage only, so they're in early days yet, or where they are commercially available, where there might be concerns or questions around how scalable they might prove to be. And I think this wildcards really align with the theme of today's webinar of those cutting edge solutions. So the wildcards, as we define them, are also those things that only show up in a subset of our scenarios. They only work under particular conditions. And that's not to say that they're not technically viable, but rather it's a matter of, are the barriers associated with them successfully overcome? Can their costs fall far enough that they can outcompete their alternatives? So some examples include things like second generation liquid biofuels. So no longer making them out of the food-based feedstocks we use today, like corn, and instead making them out of switchgrass, for example. So early days for a technology like that, but one that certainly holds a lot of potential. Another example is RNG and hydrogen in buildings. So using these clean gases in place of natural gas in our gas networks. So again, a lot of barriers and challenges there, a lot of promise. And the challenge, one of the main challenges perhaps being, can it outcompete and displace electric heat pumps, which is the other kind of technology that they'd be competing against. Negative emission solutions in industry, another really important wild card. So there's a pilot project going on in Western Canada right now for direct air capture, to actually suck carbon dioxide out of the air and then to be able to bury it underground using CCS technologies. So a lot of caveats around the viability and potential impacts of a technology like that, but an important wild card, and one that we'll come back to a bit later on. Now, what's interesting is we can situate the role of these safe bets relative to the wildcards in our analysis. And so what we see here in this figure is, again, we're looking across our 60 plus scenarios. The overall pathway to net zero is that line that we see in black here. And what you're seeing here in the pink wedge is the minimum contribution that comes from those safe bet solutions across all of our scenarios. So, and I'll start by kind of zooming in on Canada's 2030 target here. And we can see that at a minimum, 2/3 of the reductions would be coming from those safe bets. Wildcards playing a small role as well, a minimum of around 10%. And the in-between really being a mix across scenarios, some more safe bets, some more wildcards. But the real takeaway here being that as much as 90% of the reductions we need to get to that interim target come from those safe bets. So even when those wildcard solutions are working out in a big way, these safe bets are still critical to driving the reductions that we need in the near and medium term. And in this way, they kind of represent no regrets actions. There's the promise of wildcards, we find, does not justify a wait and see approach when it comes to the safe bets. Now, that role of those two categories flips a little bit when we look out to 2050, where the safe bets are driving a minimum of 1/3 of the reductions, but as much as 2/3 of the reductions coming from wildcards. The takeaway there being these cutting edge solutions could prove really critical to unlocking the deeper cost-effective reductions needed to get to Canada's long-term target. Now, our larger point here is you need both these things. Safe bets and wildcards are essential. You need to start on both today because we can't wait for wildcards to pan out. We need to advance and develop them. And there's no reason to wait on the safe bets because even when the wildcards are working out, and no matter how all those uncertain drivers I was talking about at the beginning play out, safe bets are critical to near-term and medium-term action. So we can be a bit more specific in terms of some of the solutions we're talking about. So in this figure, we're looking at reductions in the year 2030, and the bubbles represent the darker shaded portion of a bubble is that minimum that we see when we look across scenarios, and the larger area is that larger potential that exists in some scenarios. So again, as we can see, safe bets really critical to 2030. Wildcards and those cutting edge solutions, some of them are playing a significant role on this timeline as well. Things like hydrogen, perhaps advanced types of CCUS. But land use, and in that we mean nature-based solutions, things like the 2 billion tree commitment, a really important wild card on that 2030 horizon. Now, the reason we consider it a wild card is because, well, on the one hand, the interventions and the solutions are well known, but questions and concerns around how quickly can we scale up, concerns and questions around Indigenous rights and consent, and also around the permanence of these solutions. The gains can be lost to things like wildfire. So that's a reason that we're putting it in that wild card category, but an important one to note. Now we can flip this view now to look a little further out to 2050. And the first thing we observe, obviously, is that the bubbles are bigger. So to get to that net zero target, we're talking very deep reductions. We can see the safe bets are doing a lot of the work, really important heavy lifting going on there. A number of them are ramping up significantly in terms of the scale, but a lot of wildcards potentially coming into the mix as well. A lot more uncertainty with those though. So things like hydrogen, things like renewable natural gas made from different feedstocks. So recognizing those landfill gases, agricultural methane, those supplies are likely to get tapped out. More growth would require new feedstocks. Again, liquid biofuels, the same story there. We're also seeing advanced types of CCUS potentially playing a really significant role. So there we're thinking of the capture of unconcentrated gas streams. So the combustion of fossil fuels, capturing that. Some potential there, but a lot of uncertainty as well. And then really with a technology like direct air capture, those negative emissions technologies, you can think of these as the ultimate wild card. You know, they could change everything or they could change nothing. And I think there's a lot of important nuances and barriers around a future that has a big role for those technologies. And we walk through in detail a lot of that in our report. But we also note that these technologies could prove really critical, not only to Canada's net zero target, but to getting in line with the net negative emissions that most global assessments say is going to be necessary in the latter part of this century to avoid severe climate change. So this list of wildcards we see here, it's not necessarily an exhaustive list. There's some that we don't have great resolution on in our modeling tools, like small modular reactors, geothermal energy. So these would certainly count as wildcards, I think, as well. And also recognizing that, you know, we've got a technology lens here often. You could think of other sort of game-changing interventions more focused on behavioral change. So not suggesting this is the full and final list, but one that I did sort of want to seed the discussion with today. And also to note that, I mean, I know this is about cutting edge solutions, this webinar, but I think what our analysis has been able to show is what types of solutions might fit in that category, but also what they do and don't mean for the things we have in hand today. I think this is one of our most important findings, that the promise of those wildcards does not justify inaction and delay on the safe bets. We need to move aggressively on those today. I think I'm exactly at the 10-minute mark, so I'll call it there. Thanks, Tika.
Perfect, Jason. You did a great job. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think from there, we'll turn to James. So James, similar but distinct from the work that Jason just described, your work at Transition Accelerator has also focused on illuminating net zero pathways. In your recently published Pathways to Net Zero report, you discussed some of the broader implications for decarbonization across a range of sectors. So please take a few minutes and tell us a bit about that work.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'll just pause for a second to share my screen. Okay, is that up there successfully?
It is, yep.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a report that we issued about a month ago, prepared by the Transition Accelerator, and it's called Pathways to Net Zero. And you'll find that it's complementary in many ways to the work that Jason just presented. So this is kind of the report. And so I'll just say a few words. Well, what makes the report different? Basically, we think because we bear two lenses to bear on this problem of Canada's pathways to net zero. The first is what I would call transitions thinking, which is understanding of how past major transitions have occurred in society, particularly socio-technical transitions, which mean things like the change, how we electrified society, the emergence of the digital economy, the switch from sailing ships to steamships, and so on. So we actually have lots of experience of these large-scale transitions. So what can we learn for them for the problem, the challenge of net zero? And secondly, energy system analysis, which allows us to understand how energy is used, produced, consumed in Canada today, and what a net zero energy system would look like. Today, I'm going to more emphasize the first one because I only have 10 minutes, so I can't really go so much into the energy system approach. So this report has a very practical orientation and assessment methodology. And the sector coverage that we have is electricity, transport, buildings, oil and gas, cement, agri-food. And there are more sections that are coming and will be released in the kind of 1.1, 1.2 releases. So I'll first just say a few things about what's in the report. So for the various pathways, various sectors and systems, we basically start by looking at what are the current circumstances, the obstacles to change, disruptive currents in those sectors, other system problems that have nothing to do with climate change because they can be important levers of change. We have a summary sheet that looks at, what are the highlights of the sector, and then a detailed assessment of pathway elements that could contribute to movement towards net zero in that sector. So this is just an example for you to see of one of these assessment tables. And you'll see what we evaluate down the left-hand side. We have different technologies or approaches. And then across, we evaluate on various criteria, the maturity of the approach, the economic viability, social acceptability. Can it contribute to Canada's economic development or resolving other problems? How fit is it for net zero and so on? And then we kind of quite, daringly color them as red or yellow or green, depending on how important a contribution we think that they're going to make. And this is just briefly, I'm not going to run through this right now, but just to see, we have quite kind of succinct summaries on each of the sectors that we look at, how much they contribute to GHG emissions, what some of the major actions that we should do should be. So now I'm just going to draw out some of the general lessons of this report. And that's kind of how I'm going to use the bulk of my time. So the first thing to say is, though we're in the habit of talking about net zero transition or the energy transition or the it's really important to see that it's not just about that transition, but really we're talking about multiple transitions in multiple sectors. So most people, unless they're in the energy business, don't care so much about energy, but they do care about how they heat their house, how they get to move around, the food that they eat, and so on. So really, in order to meet climate objectives, we need major transformation in a series of important societal provisioning systems, like the electricity system, the agri-food system, the way our cities work, and so on. So it's very important, we think, to think about this not just as an emissions abatement transition, but of the changes that will take place in these major areas of society. And feeds to the second point that this is not just about emissions, but about improvement, achieving multiple societal objectives in these key areas. So we don't just want a low carbon transport system. I mean, we do, but we also want a better transport system, a fairer transport system, and the same with electricity and all the other sectors. Also, there are key disruptive currents, turbulent, kind of reversing things, turning things upside down in these sectors already. So think about the rise of autonomous vehicles as well as electric vehicles and things like that. They're going to totally rewrite the rules in the transport system. So we need to be thinking today about how we harness those changes so that they dovetail with net zero movement and don't undermine it. So here are some lessons that we think emerge from this study that really relate to policy, but of course how other actors like businesses and NGOs and so on need to think about this. And the first one to say is, the first thing I guess is that talking about net zero changes everything. I mean, we've been rattling on for climate change about 30 years, some of us anyway, and it's been framed in terms of incremental emissions reductions, trying to reduce tons of CO2 or percentages. Forget it. With net zero, it basically means don't emit greenhouse gases, stupid. Or if you do, you're going to have to figure a way to capture some of them back again. And that is beginning to change the debate in Canada. And my bet is that over the next year, you're going to see much more radical movement, because once you're talking about eliminating current emitting fossil fuel use, then you really begin to have to look at all the options in a different way. Second thing to say is the importance of sector and regional focus. There's been a lot of attention in Canada at the national level or economy-wide measures. That's fine, but change, these transitions are above all sectoral, and that's because the obstacles and the enablers for change are different in agri-food than they are in transport. Sorry, that's different again than electricity systems or cities. And the forces that you can use and the factors to mobilize for change are different. And of course, in Canada, regions are critical. We're a big country. There are different political cultures, political economy relations, natural resources. So above all, we need to think about transition in sectoral and regional terms. Thirdly, policies should be adjusted to the phase of the transition. If we look at historical changes of the kind I mentioned earlier, for instance, the change from horse-based transport systems to the rise of the modern automobile, they all go through certain phases. Long phase where not much is happening and there's experimentation with different approaches, social organization, business models, technologies, an acceleration phase, and then finally a completion stage where the new technology or approach captures the high ground and the whole economy adjusts. So we need to think about our transition policies in that vein. So something like electrification of transport, the technologies are maturing rapidly. Everything is in place. We could do that over 10 years, or we could do it over 30 years. And which one we pick makes a big difference. So in areas in which the technology and the kind of general approach is clear, our recommendation is we should bail in 100%. That means use a whole raft of multiple policy instruments, from incentives to taxes to R&D to and so on, to push that as fast as possible. So think about the adoption of EVs. Not only does that reduce carbon emissions right now, it changes a whole bunch of things in the transport system. It reduces the demand for oil, weakens the political influence of incumbent industries, and it's critical. Think about it, Canada in 10 years with no gasoline cars on the road. How does that make the politics of climate change look in Canada? On the other hand, there are other sectors which are not so mature or are much more complex. So agri-food, we know some things, we don't know other things. So in those areas, it's important to focus on research, experimentation, social models, developing new business models.
James, I'm giving you the 1 minute warning.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on my last bullet point. I will finish exactly on time. And my last point is we've futzed around too long in Canada, and the tendency is for government to want to do a bit of everything, spread all across the country, support all technologies, and let the market sort things out. It doesn't work. In large-scale transitions, governments, the state plays a critical role. You can't build, we would never have built the railroads, developed the tar sands, electrified the country if governments hadn't taken active role, selected saying, yes, we're going to have nuclear power, or no, we aren't. Yes, we're going to build this or that. So we have to pick priorities and then invest in them at scale. And not picking priorities and kind of standing back and assuming things will get sorted out is a way actually of not addressing the problem. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. And sorry to interject there. I hate having to do that because it's always when somebody's just on a roll with the really good content. But thanks so much for helping us to stay on track. I'm also noticing that there's really good conversation going on in the chat and good questions in the Q&A. And I am really conscious of how much I wish we could have this conversation in person. This would be such a great thing for us to be able to bring to a conference and be able to like really get into the weeds and talking about all the things that have been presented so far. So we will do that one day when that's possible again. But let's move on. So now that we've heard a bit about how policy experts are thinking about the possibilities for these net zero pathways, let's turn to some practical examples from communities where the transition's already actively underway. And Jake, I'm going to turn to you first. Your work with the Sierra Club in Ottawa is focused on tackling air pollution, a strategy that addresses health considerations while also having the added benefit of helping to curb urban carbon emissions. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you see the work that you're doing to address air pollution as an integral part of your city's pathway to net zero emissions by 2050?
Okay, thank you, Tika. Appreciate that. Appreciate being part of this whole session. It's not only get a chance to tell our story, but to hear what others are doing with respect to saving our planet and looking after the world around us. It's nice to hear, nice to know. I appreciate being part of it. Why air pollution and climate change are stuck together in the same session? Well, as far as I'm concerned, climate change is something that affects all of us, but sometimes I think people don't realize that it's affecting them seriously and that it's affecting them already. and it's sometimes lost in the mix that something in the future, I live in high ground, I'll be okay if the floods happen, I'm going to be okay. Well, almost anything you do with air pollution, and by reducing air pollution, by reducing the emissions that cause air pollution, will have a positive effect on the environment, on our global climate change that is unfortunately happening as we speak. But the more important thing in right now, why air pollution I think is important and why it should be part of the mix when we're talking about climate change, is that it's affecting every one of us right now today, unfortunately in a negative way. I don't think people realize, and I didn't myself know all these things until I got into this project. We're trying to look at air pollution here in Ottawa, but some of our research in the project has led me to understand that across the planet, air pollution is killing probably as many people as have been killed by COVID-19. To be more exact, here in Canada, last year, according to Health Canada, these are numbers that have been vetted by that agency, about 14,600 people had died from air pollution. That happens to coincide pretty closely to the number of people who died from COVID-19 during that year. And yet we never hear about air pollution. We hear a lot about, and rightly so, about COVID-19, but the same number of people are dying from air pollution. And in a way that's worse, we're all being negatively affected by air pollution. Whereas we can avoid COVID-19 if we're lucky enough and if we're careful enough, you really can't avoid, well, you could, but it's very hard to avoid air pollution as it currently exists in this country. Looking at Ottawa itself, the number of people who would have died last year from air pollution in our city is about 500, again, using numbers and data from Health Canada. That's actually a little bit more than died in Ottawa from COVID-19. So it's a serious issue, and it's not sort of one that we can kind of get out of the way. Fortunately or unfortunately, and it's often termed that way, it's an invisible killer. We kind of take it for granted. We take it for granted that we breathe some 5,000 times every day, and yet we don't really understand what we're taking in. A little side story, if I may throw out to you, is that I used to know a gentleman who was very well associated with the medical community in Toronto, and he knew a doctor there who did autopsies. And this doctor said that he could tell how long someone had lived in Toronto by how black their lungs were when he did his autopsies. Kind of a scary thought. So what's happening in our air pollution project? We got together and bought these small handheld, probably not much bigger than this calculator, monitors, which can allow us to run around town and tell us instantly what the air pollution is like. So we've been doing that. We've been measuring mostly PM 2.5, which is kind of the I guess the standard for air pollution if you're doing the handheld sort of citizen scientist level of work. And we've been trying to find out where are the air pollution areas in the city that are doing us harm, and how bad really is it in the city. In Ottawa, there's one government air quality station. It's stationed downtown in a big, huge park. And typically the readings from that park, from that station, are in the low risk range. So if someone was just trying to keep track of air pollution and was reading the government sort of stats on that, they'd look at the daily ratings for air quality in the city and say, low risk, sounds good to me. And then out they'd go and do their thing. Well, just a few feet, literally a block from that station, there's a whole area of Ottawa's, one of our main downtown streets, where the air pollution is along the whole thing is at a very dangerous level, probably most of the day, probably most of the year. And yet I'm pretty sure people have no idea about that. So let me just show you a few of the results just from our Ottawa, if I could put that up or have that slide put up. Nathan, are you there? Can you stick that one slide up? Thank you. These are just some of the sites that we found in Ottawa, which are considered air pollution hotspots. These are sites where the air pollution is at a level that if you were living near there and that was the level that you were getting all year round, you'd be suffering ill effects that could be actually measurable in terms of your shortening your life and increasing your risk for any number of diseases. Actually, it reminds me of a recent study that more or less said air pollution basically is affecting every one of the organs in our body in a negative way. It's only a matter of degree that we can really discuss. It's kind of a scary thought. And another little fact to throw your way about air pollution, the livable level of our atmosphere that we can breathe in is about 16 kilometers high, and that's it. After that, we can't breathe that part anymore. So we don't have an awful lot of sort of buffer zone there to worry, to consider that we could be poisoning, and we are poisoning, quietly poisoning the air that we need to live in. And the air is basically used as a garbage disposal for many of the industrial and commercial and the residential uses that we make of our air. So let me just look at these sites. Now, these are particular sites in Ottawa, but I think that every one of these could be relevant to wherever you happen to live. West End Industrial Site, there's a garbage dump out there at this particular site. There's a waste recovery site going on. There's a concrete plant, and there's several welding shops in this area. The site was so bad that my car, when I was out there testing that air, was covered in a sort of a green dust in about 5 minutes. And people live around there. There's a restaurant right around there. And it's not like this is some isolated area in the middle of nowhere. It's not. It's people drive by it every day, and people are living nearby it as well. Stittsville, a local community just west of Ottawa, at the school bus drop-off, diesel fuel buses come in there and roll in, and they drop off several hundred kids in the morning. Right at that site, I went there with my meter, and it's in the danger zone the whole time the buses were there. I understand it's even worse, and I want to go out to confirm that during the winter, because the buses don't shut off when they're letting the kids off. In the summertime they do shut off. In the wintertime they don't, just to keep themselves warm and the kids. A Costco parking lot in Canada, right near where the entrance is. Again, high readings, probably all during the day, a lot of traffic just stopping and going right in that area. And how many of us have gone there? Luckily, we don't hang out in it too long, but it's still there. And it just goes to show you that even a site like that, which is a rural area, it has high pollution areas, high pollution ratings. Downtown Parliament Hill, the center of our Parliament, of the Government of Canada, is an area where, because of construction, because of high traffic, and because there are high buildings around which tend to hold the pollution in, that area is polluted to, again, at dangerous levels. Downtown Rideau Street area, that's an area that's right near where the government station is situated. It's bad all day long, lots of construction, building a lot of high-rise condominiums there, a lot of traffic going through there. Another area where I certainly wouldn't want to live, and I'm sure if people who live there knew about it, they wouldn't want to live there either. Bank Street, one of our main streets in Ottawa at Lansdowne Park, which is a sort of an area of the city where a lot of people congregate, another bad zone. One of our major highways where they're doing a lot of construction work on the interchange itself. Again, bad news there in terms of air quality, and there's a seniors residence almost right off at that spot. And it's not all happening in the city. Ottawa has some rural areas. Manotick is a small town south of Ottawa. Out there, they're burning a lot of waste wood at the farms when they're cutting down wood to increase their cultivable agricultural area. It's bad news. It's kind of like a wildfire going down in a very localized area. So those
Jake, I'm going to give you the 1 minute warning now too.
Thank you. Those are hot spots we have in Ottawa. I think the same thing exists everywhere. The point of my presentation is that air pollution is affecting everybody now. We need to know more about it. People need to know what's happening in their backyard. And I don't think they know. And hopefully our little project is going to create a little bit of buzz, and people are going to start wondering, what is this there all about? And why should I be concerned? And what do I do to do something about it? And how can we make our authorities start to notice and move on the subject? I hope this has been meaningful and useful for you.
Thanks so much. Okay, and so I'm going to move us along to our final presentation, or our final speaker today, and that's Lewis Archer from Save the Children. Save the Children is one of our newest members of Climate Action Network as of this Monday at our last board meeting. So welcome to the CAN-Rac family, Lewis. I'm going to turn to you to talk about how First Nations communities that you work with, that you and your team are working with, are thinking about climate change, both here and now and into the future. In particular, you work with Indigenous children, and how are they experiencing this period of transition, both today and what are they thinking about what lies ahead in the coming years?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, Tika. And thank you to James, Jake, and Jason for those interesting talks, and Jake for those truly terrifying stats on air pollution there. So this is certainly a big departure from the previous 3 presentations, talking more about kind of adaptation priorities as identified by Indigenous children. First of all, I do recognize the absurdity of having me, kind of a white British settler in Canada, speaking to the experiences of Indigenous children. Much rather have had someone with lived experience presenting alongside me, but the timelines didn't quite work out, so I'm afraid you are stuck with me for now. Just quickly, Save the Children is the world's leading organization for children, working in about 120 different countries. Our work here in Canada focuses exclusively on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, recognizing that they are least likely to have their rights upheld. Oh dear. So when my slide changes. When working with Indigenous children in Canada, we have two ways of working. One of which is in kind of what I would call emergency response. Can you see my second slide now?
Yeah, it's just in the there. Oh no, yeah, there. Now it's working.
Okay, perfect. So the first is in kind of building resilience to climate extremes and disasters. And the second being kind of child-focused, child-led vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning. Again, kind of very much community-led, child-led, youth perspectives at the heart of all of this, community priorities at the heart of all of this. Because of the way that we design our programs and work with communities, each of these projects across the country, they all look very different. No 2 projects look the same. They're kind of specific to different cultures, geographies, contexts, communities, children. So I think one of the first things that has been a very obvious priority that has come up from Indigenous children and their caregivers is the impact of climate change on mental health. So there's a lot of literature that talks about climate change and anxiety, depression, PTSD. We know that this is much more severe on reserve in First Nations, in part because of some of the stats that are on screen now, in parts and a large part because of kind of just the historic, the colonial context. And I think that we see this anxiety, and we see the anxiety come out on kind of a day-to-day level around the uncertainty of recognizing change in ecosystems, recognizing the increased extreme weather events. And we also see kind of more traumatic events in children losing friends or losing loved ones, when there are people maybe playing on the lake ice or on the sea ice, or kind of on the shoulder seasons, and the thaw dates or the freeze over dates have changed and not quite safe for play or traditional activities. We also start to see quite significant trauma, anxiety, depression related to those big climate-related emergencies and disasters. So a big one that I kind of will very quickly speak to now is from the Island Lake region in central Manitoba. In 2017, there was a fairly significant forest fire that evacuated about 4,000 people, from the north of Manitoba down to Winnipeg. Now imagine you're a small child on that boat, and there aren't very many of those boats getting you out of your community. And then you get in the plane and you look out the window of the plane and you see the smoke, and you see kind of your home, your home is amongst those trees. So you've got this challenging evacuation process. And then once children are evacuated, oftentimes separated from their families, heightened vulnerabilities in the cities. We often hear reports of kind of sex trafficking, predatory kind of drug dealing around the evacuation centers, and children facing kind of racial discrimination to not being allowed into, say, the hotel's pool or play facilities where other settler children are able to play. And then, of course, upon return to community, after all of this, after children have been through all of this stress, We see increased externalizing behaviors, means they're kind of acting out at school. They are adopting kind of more negative coping mechanisms. And of course, there are many other stresses in their lives. So this is one of the major priorities that I think that we're working in partnership with many communities across the country on, is providing mental health services before, during, and after climate-related climate extremes and disasters. Mental health probably being the number one priority that we have come across so far. Next, I want to speak very quickly to the vulnerability and assessments that are child-led. We use methods like photo voice, in which we give children cameras to take images of things that they deem to be climate kind of priorities, vulnerabilities. We don't use quite this language, but to get children thinking about what climate change means to them in their daily lives, and then use other methods like concept mapping to kind of to get an understanding of how they relate to community priorities. Some of the big things here, I think the most important one is children often talk about how climate change is impacting infrastructure. They note that they worry about school being closed, particularly on the coldest or the warmest days, or of course in those extreme situations like the one I just spoke to. Very much aware of the fact that some of the places they live might have one road in and out of the community. If that floods or is blocked by fire, then they're trapped, and that is very much at the top of mind. Children, we often hear children speaking to their physical health, able to make these connections between the changing weather, the changing climate, and allergies, mold, and associated respiratory issues. Asthma comes up a lot. But mostly, and I think this is kind of the most important one, the thing that comes up is children talking about the need for a renewed or a restored relationship with Mother Earth. Oftentimes, through these projects, we collect a lot of quotes from children, often talking to kind of Mother Earth is sick and we need to do something about it. So I'll close with two quick quotes from two children, one from Shoal Lake 40 in Treaty 3 area and one from Wapsimong First Nation. Mother Earth is our home and is a beautiful place. Mother Earth gives us food, water, plant life, and oxygen. I feel home, I feel loved, for Mother Earth is our home. There is one reserve that is drowning because of all the rising water, because Mother Earth is sick. That is from Chase, grade 4 in Shoal Lake. And then second, I'm writing to tell you that the Earth we live in is in trouble. We are poisoning her body. Mother Earth provides food, water, oxygen, and shelter for us and the animals. I'm worried that we too will get sick. Everyone in the world needs to help Mother Earth get better. I like to swim and fish in the summertime. I hope I can still play in the water when I get old. That is from Drew in Wapsimong First Nation, Treaty 3, Ontario. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lewis. That really hits in the heart. Yeah, it is very interesting. I knew that this was going to be the crux of the conversation that we would have, where the theoretical and the possible meets what happens on the ground. Where there's emotion and the complexity of community dynamics and lived experience. And I think that's the question that I want to close with, to pose to each of you, our panelists. So given what we've heard today, I'd love to invite each of you to just take a minute or two, which is not nearly enough time, but at least something, to comment on how you think we can work toward alignment between what theory tells us might be a least cost, most feasible, most impactful, most practical pathway, and what's actually achievable or happening on the ground. So I don't know, who would like to start? Jason, I see you unmuted. Do you want to take a crack at that question?
I can kick it off, and I just wanted to say to the participants, I'm sorry I went quiet in the chat 20 minutes ago. I'm having the most bizarre technical problem where my spacebar button's stuck down, so all I get is spaces when I try to type. It's still going. I can't get it to stop, so I'm sorry. But yeah, to your question, I mean, I think that there is a ton of work to do. I mean, the work we've done at the Institute on this stops short of what's most desirable and it, at times even what's most likely. I think that's obviously not enough, and we're actively convening conversations with industry, with youth, with governments, with regions about what will the transition look like in your part of the country? What's most desirable when we think beyond mitigation to, air pollution impacts, to employment co-benefits, to the kind of energy system and society we're trying to build. So I think James's work is an important step in contribution in that direction. I'm encouraged by this new net zero advisory panel that's going to be really undertaking a broad engagement role to really try to define what do we want out of this, or what do Canadians seem to say that they want. So that's an important step, but we can't talk and talk all day, as we know. It's time for action, and our work, and to kind of riff on one of the questions that I didn't get to answer in the chat, our work is really trying to kind of take seriously the promise of cutting edge solutions, but really not let them serve as a distraction. There's so much we know we have to do that we can get on with today that's really critical. So lots to discuss and talk about and figure out, but we need action. And I think everybody recognizes that. And as James was saying, I mean, I think there's reasons to be encouraged on that front with the increasing seriousness that not only citizens, but governments and investors seem to be taking climate change with. So lots to do, but reason to be encouraged at times, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and good luck with your space bar. James, I see you're also unmuted. Do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a bit in the same sense as Jason. I use the example of the personal vehicles or light duty vehicles as an example in an area where we kind of know what the shape of the pathway will be. And thus we can put there's an old mixed metaphor, the foot on the gas pedal in order to accelerate change in that area. And I point out how it relates. So for instance, if we accelerate vehicle electrification, this will help enormously on the air pollution problem. It's not the only source that Jake was talking about, but get all the internal combustion engines and the diesel fuel trucks off the road, and you can make a tremendous impact there. The auto industry is a big employer in regions in Canada. If we don't move to support the move to electrification quickly, we will lose that industry if it's stuck making gas guzzling SUVs. And that industry is strategic in terms of links to robotization, to self-driving cars, all sorts of other things. So again, that's an area. And though there are all sorts of uncertainties, people say, well, what about fuel cell vehicles? And what about biofuels? Yes, but the market internationally, batteries have won that competition for light duty vehicles. They may even win the truck one, but the truck one is open with hydrogen fuel cells perhaps. So the question really is to really push that transition. And there are other areas, buildings and so on. And in each case to sew in the justice elements, the welfare elements, the human preoccupations, so that each of these systems is better in multiple ways as we move forward.
Jake or
sorry,
Lewis?
just
go ahead.
So I'm so sorry. There's so many questions in the chat that it's hard to type little answers. I typed some, but feel free to look at our report, because some I think are addressed there, and people can email me if they want to engage in a further discussion. Sorry.
Sure. Thanks, James. I know I'm watching the chat and I see the Q&A box as well. And there are so many questions, so much discussion, and we just don't have the space or time to address all of them. I can hardly wait till we can meet in person again and do this in person. Jake or Lewis, either of you have thoughts that you want to share on how we make that marriage between theory, policy, and what's practical and necessary?
It's quite a quick and easy answer from my side, I think. Recognizing, again, coming from a very different perspective on kind of the adaptation, climate change, vulnerability stuff. I think the important thing to really notice is that this climate change vulnerability, or the the ways in which Indigenous children experience climate change differently from other children, it's not by accident, right? It's definitely hundreds of years of design and colonialism and discrimination. And I think what might lead to kind of quick, actionable progress, and that makes it sound easy, but is commitment to reconciliation, the principles of truth and reconciliation, the calls of truth and reconciliation. I think many of the systems that I spoke to, the schools, the emergency management systems, the kind of mental health resources currently available on reserve are just so diminished relative to elsewhere in Canada. And I think when we start looking at some of these other social or economic or cultural components, we can really start to bolster community capacity, adaptive capacity.
Yeah. Jake, last word from you.
Well, just a quickie. I think we all have to become a little more informed of what's happening around us. Right now, the mainstream media and every other sort of form of communication seems to be centered on COVID-19. That's maybe important, that I'm not trying to diminish it, but there's a lot of things happening that have really serious long-term effects for all of us and for our planet. I think it's up to us as individuals and collectively, as your organization and others can do, is we got to start doing something more than just sitting back and being kind of led along. Because right now we're being led along in a pathway that doesn't have a great ending as it stands today.
Thanks for that thought. So we've only got a couple of minutes left here. I am not going to fill that with trying to get you to answer another question, but there were a few really good ones that came up in the chat, and one in particular that I'm struck by that I saw just a few minutes ago from Paul. Wondering, does everybody actually recognize the large scale of action that's required right now? And it's a great question. And I think it's the one that drives a lot of the work that we all collectively do. So there's so much to do and so many good ideas that have been shared today. I think the combination of good brains and good hearts is what's going to guide us. I'm really, really grateful to have had a chance to speak with all four of you today and to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much for the great work you're continuing to do. This has been really a lovely session, a lovely hour to spend with all of you. Next week, we'll continue this series, same time, same place. If you haven't yet registered for next week's webinar, the one next week focuses on finance. So we have a number of speakers representing different types of campaigns, strategies, and tactics being used in the world of finance. You can find the registration link on our website at climateactionnetwork.ca/pathways to zero. You can also find all the past webinars there as well. So I look forward to watching next week's webinar. Lauren will be hosting that one, and I hope you can all join us there. Thank you so much again for being with us today.
Thank you, Tika. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.